Hello, everyone. We're back again. I'm going to finish up this this last lecture for the week, but we are still talking about progressive presidents, and I wanted to kind of stop here because we talked about some of the changes that Theodore Roosevelt represented as a president, somebody who was very active in policy. Um, since Theodore Roosevelt, and subsequent presidents after Franklin Roosevelt have all had to have some kind of agenda. Um, they're all, and it's expected. Even today, when you look at those who run for office in the last 100 years, there's some kind of agenda that they have. It may not be very extensive. It may be minor, but they have something. And so my point on all that is that this is sort of the trend that has started with presidents being much more active. Now, um, okay, there we go. We're going to start with Taft, and one of the things I want to kind of bring in here is sort of the dichotomy. Taft and Roosevelt were fairly good friends. Taft was much more conservative, I think, than Roosevelt. But at the same time, Roosevelt made a fatal mistake. He was reelected in 1905, and at his inauguration, um, he made a fatal slip. I think all presidents are entitled to a few. But his pledge was to not run for reelection in 1908. Well, that immediately, makes a president a lame duck, if you will. And Roosevelt felt that he made the pledge, and he felt that he had to stand by it. So he didn't run for reelection, but he found somebody to replace him. And that man, of course, was William Howard Taft. And then when Taft became president in 1908, Roosevelt went off to Africa to hunt wild game for the Smithsonian. Well, at least that's what we know it is. In the 1908 election, mostly because of the fact that Taft was helped, we see a kind of, it was really not much of a contest. William Howard Taft had served as a federal judge from Ohio. He had been the governor of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. And he had also served in the cabinet with Roosevelt, and I believe I believe he was the a Secretary of War. But after that, Taft really had an easy time. He defeated William Jennings Bryan, who ran for a third time. That was his third and final run in 1908, and he was defeated for a third and final time. But in this, even though Taft was a little more politically conservative than Theodore Roosevelt, he really actually pursued some of the policies much more aggressively than Theodore Roosevelt. In Taft's original inaugural address, he expressed the progressive view, quote, that the scope of a modern government has been widened far beyond the principles laid down by the old laissez-faire school of political writers. This it doesn't sound like much, but it's really the beginning of a change we're starting to see, and we have seen since the late 19th century, that we're now moving toward a more activist federal government, and as a people, we are expecting the federal government to do more. As far as temperamentally, even though Roosevelt even though, excuse me, Taft was more temperamentally suited, I think. He did pursue more antitrust legislation than Roosevelt. You know, Roosevelt had became the trust buster. That was what he ran on in 1905, and people loved it. Taft continued that same policy. Eventually, he even persuaded the Supreme Court in 1911 to declare Rockefeller Standard Oil Company as violating the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it to be broke up. So that's important too. The government under Taft also won an important case under the American Tobacco Company. The Supreme Court ordered an end to pricing policies that, you know, would drive smaller firms out of business. And so, you know, we start to see more and more, and in these decisions, we start to see that the Supreme Court announces a new standard for judging large corporations. The rule of the rule of reason, oh goodness, which had been implemented during Theodore Roosevelt's time. You know, that distinction between good trust and bad trust had been fairly much put into effect at this point. Big businesses were not those big businesses that were not in it just for money could survive. Those who were not would be prosecuted, and those who engaged in antitrust policies would be prosecuted as well. Under William Howard Taft, who had supported the 16th Amendment, we got the graduated income tax, which authorized Congress to enact an income tax. Now, there had been an income tax before, temporarily during the Civil War, but the Supreme Court had, during that time period, had declared it unconstitutional because under the Constitution, Congress cannot there was it had to do with the way that they interpreted Article 1, Section 8, that the powers of Congress had, and it was determined that a income tax was unconstitutional. But to overdo that, of course, the 16th Amendment was enacted, and therefore, you know, an income tax would be implemented. And this is really not a big income tax. It was really morally ratified mostly before Taft left office. And really, it didn't affect most people. And in effect, it was a 2% income tax on incomes of more than $4,000. This had been something that had been enacted back in 1894, and of course, most people, you know, the Supreme Court had declared it sort of as a, quote, communistic threat to prosperity. Well, we've had the income tax since then, and it's neither a threat to prosperity nor is it communistic. But at the same time, this movement of the income tax united a lot of people, and in particular, that progressive wing of people. Remember Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was winning those Western farmers and Southern farmers in particular. And the income tax united these people who wanted to reduce the government's dependence on revenue that they got from tariffs. Because remember, tariffs were what's preventing farmers from selling their goods overseas. And of course, this also was stemmed from a belief that it discriminated against non-industrial states. In other words, those states that didn't have industry, you know, had to pay more of the share. That's what they felt. So progressives believe that taxation should be based on the ability to pay, and so it was graduated. Matter of fact, it wasn't until the 1930s. You know, most people, think about this: the average income in a year might be, you know, $300-400. Now that sounds absolutely insane. But it is. That's about how much it was. And so, you know, if you most people didn't have to pay. It was only the higher incomes that had to pay. And imagine this, you actually had to write a letter to the Office of Internal Revenue in Washington to get the forms. You couldn't just pick them up anywhere. Now, this is a key step in the modernization of the federal government. The income tax provided a federal government with a flexible resource of revenue for national, state, and state policies. That, especially because we are now seeing a federal government and a state government that are expanding in its responsibilities as far as regulation are concerned, and so forth. Despite all this, Taft really did gravitate toward a more conservative side of the Republican Party. He, like only a few months after becoming president, he signed the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which reduced rates on imported goods, but not nearly as much as people wanted. So it's kind of a measure that they're not so have to. But we're also starting to see a rift that begins within the Republican Party, a rift between the progressive wing of the Republican Party and the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And this rift begins when Richard Ballinger, who is the Secretary of the Interior, concluded that Theodore Roosevelt had exceeded his authority in placing placing land and forest reserves under the control of the federal government. This is something that he concluded. How nice. He also was able to was also involved in, of course, selling off interest in this as well. Ballinger decided to return some of that land to the public domain, whereby you could now get a lease, or a mining company or a lumber company could get a lease and get access to those preserved forest, the forests or the mining sources that was on public land. Yeah. And so you can imagine this is not going to do well for the conservationists do not like this, and so neither do the preservationists. But the conservatives see land, even today, they see land as something to be exploited. They don't see it as something necessarily to be preserved. And I don't mean this to be mostly, I'm saying mostly, and we're looking mostly in the business class. They look at the forests and see, not something to preserve, but a renewable resource. And indeed, most people actually saw it that way up until, throughout the 19th century. Here, this has been sort of a slowly evolving term. And this is where I think we start to see the beginnings of the modern environmental movement, stemming from these old ideas, which will eventually come up in the late 1960s. But right now, this return of land caused a big rift. Now, Gifford Pinchot, who was a member of the Forest Service, and he accused Ballinger of colluding with business interests and repudiated some of these goals that he accused the Taft administration of repudiating some of these goals. And he did this very vocally. And because, of course, did it very vocally, we can see that, you never want to make your boss look bad if you can prevent it. And of course, when Taft later would fire Pinchot in 1910, and so now you see that there's this breach within the party that becomes irreparable. And by 1910, Theodore Roosevelt has come back to the United States, and he's regretting a lot of things that have happened. And he decides that he's going to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. That's a gutsy decision. Most people didn't want this to happen. It really, really was a surprise to a lot of people, and they knew it was going to divide the Republican Party. It also drove, I think, a lot of progressives, Midwestern progressives, out of the Republican Party and into a different coalition later on. What happened, of course, is you have to remember there's a new thing that's going on here, in that we have the introduction of some primaries in the early 20th century. Now today, as we're going through the primary process, each party has different methods, but each party's candidate for president has to be get the votes of the primary, which starts like 6 months before the convention, the year of the election, sometimes even more. And so we're in the middle of that process right now. But you have to remember that while today it wasn't until after 1968 that the primaries actually were helpful. Primaries really did not control who would become the presidential candidate. It was usually regional bosses, people who controlled delegates. A lot of times when you go into a convention, just before up until 1968, there's always the possibility that you could, have somebody going into the convention and that you might think be the front runner and come out with somebody completely different. But Taft, you have to also understand, was in control of the conservative wing of the party. And as a result, he controlled pretty much the party. And if you're the president, you control the party structure of your party usually. Taft ran in the primaries. But you also have to understand that no matter how many times Taft won in the primaries, it didn't matter because the primaries would not give Roosevelt enough delegates to win the nomination. The object here for Theodore Roosevelt was to show that Taft wasn't electable. The object was to show that Theodore Roosevelt was more electable and more popular among a bigger cross-section of the population. He would go to the convention and he would have a lot of delegates, but delegates that were chosen by the people. But what really happened was the Taft forces at the election were overwhelming. They refused to seat the Roosevelt delegates, and there were only a little over 200 of them. And they weren't allowed to vote, and Theodore Roosevelt bolted the party when this happened. In other words, he left the party, and a few days later he would form the Progressive Party. And I think only a character like Theodore Roosevelt could have done that. We haven't had too many characters in the past who could have done that. One person who probably could have done that recently probably would have been Hillary Clinton. And I say that because when she lost, and it was really a major delegate fight because she had more delegates going into the 2008 convention, but she didn't bolt the party, and she could have easily bolted the party and split the Democratic Party, but she didn't. And that takes guts. Whether you like the person or not. She really, and the thing is she probably, I don't know if she could have won or not. That's the thing. But I do think that she could have split the Democratic vote very easily. There were a few other people that probably could have done that in the Republican Party earlier on, but not so much as many more. Usually, from 1972 on, really by the time the convention occurs in either party, it's pretty much a done deal. We already know who's going to be the nominee. We already know who has the stuff. But in this one, it was really quite something. And so by the time we get to the election of 1913, we have a four-way contest. You have, and they're all progressives in one form or another. Excuse me. You have the Republican, probably the more conservative one here, of William Howard Taft, who is the sitting president, and he has the conservative wing of the Republican Party. You have Theodore Roosevelt, who has the progressive wing of the Republican Party. You have this new progressive Democrat, former governor of New Jersey, sort of the darling of the Democratic Party right now, who won the nomination after, I think, 46 ballots. No, actually, it was 113 at the Baltimore Convention. And then, of course, you have Debs, who's running as a socialist. And Debs is important here, too, all three of these. And when you look at this, though, the election became a debate between the political and economic freedom in the age of business. And that's what became the tone of this, what relationship that would have. Whoops, sorry, guys, went too fast. Now, Taft stressed individualism. And so on the extremes, you have, on the right, you have Taft, who stressed the individualism, that this supposedly is the remain of the social order, and as long as, so long as government and private enterprise could cooperate in addressing these social ills, he didn't think anything needed to be changed that much. At the other extreme, you have Eugene Debs, who was the socialist, who relatively few Americans supported, but he wanted, this is the other end of it. I would say, well, actually, I wouldn't, he wants to abolish the whole entire capitalistic system. But its immediate demands included things like public ownership of railroads and the banking system, government aid to unemployment, unemployment insurance, laws establishing shorter working hours, a minimum wage. Summer, this is a summarized, forward-looking progressive thought. This is much more drastic than um, Taft. So these are the two extremes, and in the middle, you've got the main battle, which was between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And really, the big overgrowing view here was the role of federal government in securing economic freedom. And this is the main battle here. And these two kind of represented the two competing strands of progressivism. Both believed that government action was necessary to preserve individual freedom, but they differed on the dangers of increasing government power and the inevitable economic concentration of power. In other words, this again is that issue of how should the government allow for big corporations? Should we allow them? Shouldn't we allow them? Both represented these competing strands, and both both believed that government action was necessary to preserve individual freedom. This goes to that whole notion of using Hamiltonian means to obtain Jeffersonian ideals, okay? But they differed. What they differed in was the strategies and the level of dangers of increased government power and economic concentration. Wilson represented the states' rights laissez-faire ideology. What Wilson was looking at, he saw this something as completely different. And he had presided over implementation of a system of workmen's compensation and state regularization of railroads in New Jersey that did real well. And Wilson wanted to make sure that he wanted to use government to get rid of a lot of the big business and to kind of return to this nation of small producers, whereby everyone there was an even playing field, an even sense of competition, okay? Where, there is no Standard Oil, there are other oil companies and they're all competing because of their product. It's a nice ideal. And that's, of course, what we call the New Freedom. This was strongly influenced by a man named Louis Brandeis, who was Woodrow Wilson's consultant on the campaign. Louis Brandeis would later be the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And Wilson felt that democracy had to be reinvigorated by restoring market competition. He feared big government at the same time as much as he feared the power of corporations. But sometimes, as the government, as corporations grew, government needed to grow to kind of even things out. And so what is the New Freedom? Well, the New Freedom, this is what the New Freedom is. This envisions the strengthening antitrust laws, protecting the rights of workers. So you can see that this is going to be where the unions are going to come in. The unions certainly will support this. And this is why the unions, tend to support the Democratic Party mostly. And the fact that the Democratic Party since the early 20th, late 19th century has always supported this, has always been something. We also want to encourage small businesses to create conditions for economic competition and increasing government regulation to protect that. And he wanted to make sure that he felt that corporations were likely to corrupt government, and so government had to manage it. In other words, government had to be there. Now, to Theodore Roosevelt supporters, they thought Wilson was some kind of relic, and he thought that they thought this only served the needs of just one group of people, the small businessmen. Had ignored the importance of economic concentration. The fact that this is something that occurred, Roosevelt always said this is something that happens all the time. And for Theodore Roosevelt, can you imagine these two positions. I mean, this is kind of hard. How would you vote on this one if you had to choose between the two? Um, for Theodore Roosevelt supporters, their claim was that Wilson didn't consider the interests of professionals, consumers, and they didn't. Labor. Wilson and Brandeis spoke of the curse of business, but nationalism, what was called the New Nationalism. This is what Theodore Roosevelt's program in 1912 was. This is one of those questions where you're going to have to remember, because Theodore Roosevelt had two programs. This one was the New Nationalism. And the New Nationalism was the idea of what Theodore Roosevelt spoke of. This was something that was that only the controlling and directing power of government. Can you imagine? This is a Republican talking. National government could prevent and help allow the benefits of big business to be used without government having to intervene to counteract its abuses. So as long as there's some kind of regulation there. So here the New Nationalism is quite something, here's some of the things that he's calling for. This is a Republican. He called for that. He said, of course, that only the controlling and directing power of the government could restore the liberty of the oppressed. He called for heavy taxes on the personal and corporate fortunes. The end of an inheritance tax. The end of an inheritance. In other words, you had to have a big inheritance tax. Federal regulations of industries. Railroads, mining, coal, not federal takeover, federal regulation. He also instituted some things for the blueprints of what would later become the modern welfare state, with women, things like, workman's compensation, Social Security, later what would be called Social Security and old age pensions, and of course, unemployment insurance. These are things that we'll later get under Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, he supported women's suffrage. And of course, increased federal supervision of the corporate enterprise. He also did a bunch of other things here that's just amazing here. He called for wanted a national health care program and legislation for women and children. In other words, limiting the hours that women could work. This is something that will be coming up later on in the 1920s. And of course, the 8-hour day and a living wage for all workers. And I mentioned social insurance, things like unemployment and so forth. But, this is the most important. This progressive platform is like the most important political document since the end of the Civil War. And what the Theodore Roosevelt campaign does is it helps to give freedom a modern social and economic content. That notion that you don't have this freedom, you in order to have, that government has to be there to prevent people from, corporations from allowing people to participate. This is an agenda that would define political liberalism for the rest of the 20th century. The idea that, you can talk about freedom all you want, but if you don't have an economic element to it, it's really not freedom. In other words, you can, if somebody can be able to work all they want, but if there's no job to give them, then what kind of freedom is that? I mean, there's a lot of this. In the election, you can see what Theodore Roosevelt's FX did. Wilson, of course, won 6.3 million voters. He won 42% of the national vote. Theodore Roosevelt won 4.1 million votes. This is the only time that a third-party candidate would get above 20% of the vote ever in the U.S. election history. But you can see that Taft came in at a 3.5 million. He won 2 states with a total of 8 electoral votes. You can see how the electoral votes balances things here, because Wilson, what happens in this election? Wilson is able to keep his keep enough of the vote, but what happens is Theodore Roosevelt took a lot of votes away from Taft, and as a result, he split the Republicans. So this allowed Wilson to win 40 states. which, possibly wouldn't have happened. And so with that, with Theodore Roosevelt's intervention here, we see that, in particular with all this, that, the progressives end up leaving the Republican Party. Some will come back, but not many. Taft, with his 3.5 million votes, he only got 23% of the vote. But look if you add these together. There's 2% here that you don't see. But if you look at Wilson at 42 and Debs at 6, that's 48%. Okay. Theodore Roosevelt and Taft at 27-53, that's still 50%. You can still see that the Republicans would have had a majority had Theodore Roosevelt not significantly split the party. And as a result, you can see that the huge change in the electoral vote. So Wilson would be, during his first term, was really a very strong executive. This is a guy, not to be excused. You look at Theodore Roosevelt as somebody who's a strong campaigner, very active. Theodore Roosevelt was Woodrow Wilson was ever much as active as Theodore Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson was actually the only person ever to be elected to office who actually had a PhD in political science, any PhD. Theodore Roosevelt had taught at, Woodrow Wilson taught at Princeton. He later became the president of Princeton, but he had taught for years, and he wrote the college textbook, the only college textbook on congressional government. He immediately starts to change government. He establishes a congressional liaison office at the Capitol building. Now, that's a congressional liaison office between the president, the executive branch, and Congress. This is an opening up of channels. This is something that's quite remarkable. He's the first president to start to hold regular press conferences, and in order to influence public opinion. He would have regularly scheduled press conferences at regular scheduled times during the week. He did very much. He reestablishes a new trend. Yes, we can blame him for this. He reestablished the delivery of a personal message of the president during the State of the Union. Presidents do not have to do this. This is the first time since John Adams that any president had done this. It had been over 112 years. Presidents, in the 19th century didn't do this. Today all presidents use this as their laundry list of ideas that they want for the next, from Congress. And Wilson reestablishes that. And it's very important because he's also showing how relevant the office of president becomes during this time period. Before that, even Theodore Roosevelt, nobody had, they had not delivered, they just wrote their presidential message out and sent it to Congress. It was just paperwork. Now, for the last 107 years, all presidents, they get permission from Congress and they deliver their speech. That's quite something. And for the first time, the Democrats controlled Congress. And it was the first time that they controlled both houses of Congress since the Civil War. Although the Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives off and on for many years, it's the first time that, this had happened. And Wilson does a lot. He moves right away to implement his vision, his progressive vision of the United States. The first thing he does is they pass the Underwood Tariff, which reduces duties on imports to make up for lost revenue. He imposes a graduated income tax on the richest 5%, of Americans, which increases taxes coming in there. On no less than 3 occasions, this being one of them, the Clayton Act was passed, which exempted labor unions from the Sherman antitrust laws. Remember, what would happen would be a union would want to go on strike. They would go to court and they would tell the union that they couldn't go on strike because they were in restraint of trade. Well, now this law was passed and it barred courts from issuing injunctions to curtail strikes. There'll be other ways to do that, but that's one of them. He passed the Keating-Owens Act. This is one of the first times ever, and it will never. And the thing is that this is they'll do this during the entire time that Wilson was president. This is the first out of three times that they passed three that they try to outlaw child labor in the manufacturing of goods sold in interstate commerce. And each time the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. This is in 1913. The child labor will finally be outlawed in 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Can you believe that? I mean, it's only been since 1938 that we finally have child labor laws. But this was something that was far-reaching in its end. He helps pass the Adams Act, which set an 8-hour day, which was very important. Set the 8-hour day. Let me double check this before I say this. For the nation's railroad personnel. This sort of sets the trend for the next unions to kind of follow, trying to get the 8-hour day. Remember, since the 1880s, they've been trying to get the 8-hour day. Now we're starting to see this, okay? The Warehouse Act was passed. This is, remember the sub-treasury plan we talked about? Well, this is what they start to influence. This is sort of the influence of populism here. From the 1890s, which extended credit to farmers when they stored their crops in federally licensed warehouses. Yeah. So, Wilson is sort of implementing some of those progressive and or populist ideas. Now, some of Wilson's policies seem to be taken from Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism, and don't get me wrong, some of them are. And we find that the New Nationalism and the new freedom that Wilson is really. They're very quite similar in some of the things that they did. As part of this policy to implement new government regulations, there are two things that happened. Two powerful agencies that were established to supervise the economy beginning in 1912. What we see is first, do I have it on the next one? Yes. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Board was established. Now we have 13, I believe, but now there are 12 regional banks overseen by a central board appointed by the president. This is the same one that was established back in 1913. It still works today. The Federal Reserve Board is a government review. It is not the banks are still subject to the rules, but they're still privately owned. This helps banks. Especially if they're in danger of failing. We listen to this board all the time. How often do we listen to them saying, we're waiting for their quarterly meeting and are they going to raise interest rates or not? This, is something we hear. And part of this had been due to the fact that back in 1907, there had been a panic that had started, a small little crash. And, there had been a lot of tips between Theodore Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan. And in 1907, there was a delay when the failure of several financial companies had threatened the general collapse of the banking system. And Theodore Roosevelt had to go to J.P. Morgan to bail out, to make sure that the federal government wouldn't bail out. And with the federal government lacking a lot of central banking, it was left to J.P. Morgan to sort of assemble the funds to prop up what was going on at the time. And the fact that there wasn't any federal banking regulation at the time over finance, this was all entirely in private hands. This reinforced the notion that we needed to have some kind of government regulation. Another one that we should all be aware of too was he established the Federal Trade Commission to investigate and prohibit unfair business practices such as price fixing and monopolistic practices. Folks, this is where you got to go. You've got to go to the ftc.gov site, put your phone number on the do not call list. They can't call your phone number if you put your number on here to sell you anything. Now, they can call you to get money for charity. I don't recommend it because it's really quite something. But they can call you for that, and they can also call you for political contributions. But at the time, even though businesses today really disagree about this process, at the time, both were very welcomed by the business community for restoring order to the marketplace. This was really something was welcome. And this was something else that kind of helped. And by 1916, we see that the social ferment and the political mobilization of the progressive era had given birth to a new America, where you had state, federal and laws and administrative agencies and independent commissions which were out there to regulate the economy and make sure there was some kind of fairness out there. State, local, national governments assumed authority to protect the advanced industrial freedom. Governments, that notion, of course, that, the notion of industrial freedom that we're talking about, the notion that, you have some say in your workplace and that, you're not going to be totally repressed thoroughly, although that doesn't always change. The government starts to establish rules for labor relations, business behavior, financial policy, and financial policies, but also financial policies that protect, children from market abuses. I mean, we're talking at a time when, a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old could be working for wages, and there were no laws to prevent that. And those wages were not the child's, they were actually the parents'. I mean, it gets there. And most immigrants, their children worked because they had to support the family. So government starts to act as a broker among a lot of groups who start to see with these conflicts, especially with strikes and so forth, it kind of wants to threaten social harmony. We start to see more and more governments getting involved. And so that gives us up to 1916 as far as progressivism is concerned. And I hope to see you guys Friday as we talk about the Scopes trial, which we will be getting into. So thank you so much, everybody, and we'll go from there.